Imagine waking up and your bones are just physically shaking.
Yeah, that is a terrifying thought.
Right. Your vision is going dark, your bed is soaked with sweat, and there is this, like, crushing, suffocating tightness in your chest.
It sounds like you're describing someone having a heart attack.
Or, being squeezed from the inside out. Today, a modern doctor would probably look at those symptoms, pull out a diagnostic manual, and just confidently label it a severe panic attack.
Oh, for sure. They'd point straight to a nervous system overload.
But 3,000 years ago, King David looked at those same bodily symptoms, and he diagnosed them as the terrifying weight of divine wrath.
Which is such a massive shift in perspective.
It really is. Welcome to Reformed thinking. Today, we're stepping away from the clean, clinical definitions of physical ailments to look at the diagnostic landscape of the human soul.
Because the contrast between those two diagnostic methods is just striking.
Yeah, how so?
Well, a clinical diagnosis just stops at the physiological reaction, right? Notes the adrenaline spike.
Sure, it treats the body as a machine.
But the theological diagnosis goes underneath all those physiological symptoms. It locates the spiritual root cause.
So it treats the human as a whole being?
Precisely. When dealing with genuine spiritual affliction, the symptoms are always holistic. A severed relationship with the Creator bleeds directly into the physical body.
And into the emotional stability, too.
Yeah, and the psychological endurance of the individual. You can't separate them.
So we're looking at a specific commentary today to unpack all of this. We are analyzing the work of Carl Friedrich Keil.
The brilliant 19th century German exegete.
That's the one. We are focusing on his breakdown of Psalm 6, a text he titled, very appropriately, A Cry for Mercy Under Judgment.
It's an intense title.
It is. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the theological weight, the raw emotional language, and the specific Hebrew grammar that Keil highlights.
And we have the source material from his commentary right here in front of us.
We do. We are going to see how an ancient mind processed the crushing reality of guilt, step by agonizing step.
And Keil provides a really brilliant blueprint for reading this text.
He does. He points out this highly deliberate structural architecture within the psalm itself.
Yeah, he divides it into 3 distinct strophes.
Or stanzas, right.
Right. And the architecture actually bends under the emotional weight of the content.
I found that structural deviation so fascinating because normally you expect ancient poetry to maintain a rigid meter.
Right, for the sake of memorization.
Or just musical cadence. But here, the form itself mimics the function. I mean, the first strophe and the third strophe are relatively balanced.
But the middle strophe is a full third longer than the other 2.
Yeah. Why did the author drag out that middle section so much?
Well, Keil argues it represents a calmer, but much more exhausting outpouring of his heart.
Okay, so it's not just a quick transition.
Not at all. I mean, the first strophe is a frantic, panicked cry of distress.
Like the panic attack symptoms we talked about?
Yeah. And the third strophe is the arrival at a state of believing confidence.
So that extended middle section
is the agonizing bridge between the two. It's the prolonged struggle of wrestling his way from sheer terror to absolute trust.
Because moving from a state of divine judgment to a state of grace isn't just a quick, flippant pivot.
No, it takes time. And that time is visually and audibly reflected in the extended length of the text itself.
We're essentially looking at an ancient psychological blueprint mapped out in Hebrew poetry.
It's incredible.
It really is. But before we get to the specific lyrics of that struggle, we need to establish the spiritual state of the man holding the pen.
Right, because Keil points out that the psychological state of this specific author has been the subject of massive historical debate.
It's a debate that really strikes at the core of how we understand suffering. I mean, historically, the broader church reckoned Psalm 6 as the very first of the 7 penitential psalms.
Those are Psalm 6, 32, 38, 51, 102, 130, and 143.
Right. They were categorized together, likely selected with reference to the 7 days of the week.
Designed to be read as expressions of agonizing sorrow for sin.
But not everyone in the historical theological community agreed with throwing Psalm 6 into that category.
No, they didn't. Keil brings up August Hum and Franck,
the prominent 17th century theologian.
Yeah, and Franck pushed back incredibly hard against the traditional classification.
Why? What was his issue with it?
Franck wrote this extensive introduction to the Psalter, and he pointed out what he saw as a glaring issue. Psalm 6 contains no explicit named confession of sin.
Wait, really? There's no specific moment where he says he sinned?
No, there's no moment where the author says, I committed this particular crime, please forgive me.
Like David does in Psalm 51.
Right after the Bathsheba incident.
Hmm.
So, because of that absence, Franck argued it was an error for the church to classify it as a penitential psalm.
So what did Franck think it was then?
He argued that this is the prayer of a man who is severely tempted, not a man who is penitent.
Those are two radically different categories of human suffering.
Completely different. Franck assumed the author was just an innocent, suffering man crying out for help.
Completely blameless regarding whatever caused the agony.
Yeah, he thought the guy was just having a terrible time.
But Keil steps in to offer a massive theological correction to Franck's logic, doesn't he?
He does. Keil points out that Franck is making a fundamental mistake in how he understands the feeling of divine wrath.
Keil draws a razor-sharp line between a tempted man and a penitent man.
Yeah, and this is where we need to slow down and clarify the distinction, because on the surface, both men look identical.
Right, they're both in total agony.
They both feel like God has abandoned them.
So what is the fundamental difference in their suffering?
The root cause and the objective reality of the wrath are entirely different.
Give me an example of the tempted man.
Keil uses the biblical figure of Job as the prime example. Job experiences the horrifying feeling of God's wrath.
I mean, he loses his family, his health, his wealth, all in a matter of hours.
He feels like God is actively crushing him. But that feeling, as Keil notes, is perfectly groundless.
Groundless because God wasn't actually mad at him.
Right. God was not actually pouring out retributive wrath on Job. The prologue to the book makes it clear that God was actually glorying in Job's righteousness.
So the suffering was a trial.
It was a temptation to despair, but it was not a punitive strike for a specific moral failure.
Okay, so that's the tempted man. But a penitent man is dealing with a completely different objective reality.
A penitent man has a well-grounded feeling of wrath. The wrath is real.
It's an active, punitive chastisement hitting him because of his own genuine sin.
Yeah.
Let's ground this in an analogy.
Sure, go ahead.
Imagine experiencing a sudden, excruciating pain in your hand.
Okay.
If you're walking down the street and a random brick falls off a scaffolding and crushes your hand, the pain is awful.
Awful, but accidental.
Right. You are a victim of a random providential trial. You are the tempted man. You can cry out for the pain to stop with a totally clear conscience.
Because you didn't cause it.
Yeah. But what if you have that exact same crushed hand because you lost your temper and violently punched a brick wall?
Oh, wow. Yeah. The physical pain is identical.
But the psychological reality carries a completely different weight. It is a self-inflicted wound. You own the blame.
You can't just ask for the pain to stop. You have to deal with the guilt of why the pain is there in the first place.
That is the penitent man.
That analogy captures the nuance perfectly. The physical sensation is identical, but the moral reality behind the pain shifts the sufferer's entire relationship to the affliction.
But this brings up a skeptical question regarding Keil's argument.
Which is?
If there is no explicit confession of sin in the text, how does Keil prove that this specific writer is suffering a well-grounded, self-inflicted punishment?
Ah.
I mean, if the writer never explicitly says, I punched the wall, how do we know he's actually guilty and not just a victim of falling bricks?
We know through the highly specific way the writer interprets his surrounding circumstances.
How does he interpret them?
Keil explains that the writer is surrounded by aggressive human enemies. There is genuine life-threatening hostility from men closing in on him. But the writer does not view this hostility as bad luck or random political persecution.
He views the aggression as a direct manifestation of divine wrath.
Spot on. He understands that his own sin is the sting of its bitterness.
Yeah.
The human enemies are just the instruments of judgment.
The real conflict is between the writer's guilt and God's justice.
Yeah, the writer knows he deserves the hostility. He completely abandons any claim to innocence.
Furthermore, that admission of guilt dictates his primary goal in the prayer, right?
It does. Think about it. A man who thinks he is innocent just asks for the trial to end immediately.
He asks for an escape hatch.
But Keil notes that the goal of this penitent writer is not an immediate escape from the trial.
What does he want then?
His goal is to have the punitive chastisement changed into loving chastisement. He wants the nature of the suffering to shift from retributive wrath to fatherly discipline.
That concept carries massive theological weight. The writer isn't begging God to make the pain stop. He is begging God to change the reason why the pain is happening.
It's a huge distinction.
And recognizing the genuine guilt of the author leads us directly into another historical controversy.
The authorship debate.
Yes. We have to determine who actually penned these words. The text attributes it to David, but 19th century German scholars love to dissect and dispute biblical authorship.
Oh, they did. The era of higher criticism produced intense skepticism regarding traditional authorship.
Keil addresses a very specific critic named Ferdinand Hitzig.
Yeah, Hitzig looked at the emotional tone of Psalm 6, noted the sheer terror and physical collapse described in the verses.
And flatly denied that David could have written it.
He basically said, David's a tough guy, he couldn't have written this.
Hitzig's argument relies on a bizarre caricature of historical figures. I mean, he essentially claims David could not have composed such a disconcertedly despondent text because David was a warrior king.
It's so reductive.
It is. Hitzig assumes David was simply too tough to write something so broken and melancholy. It highlights a strange habit modern people have of turning ancient historical figures into one-dimensional statues.
We do that all the time.
We assume a military general who kills giants cannot also be a man who suffers from debilitating panic attacks and cries himself to sleep.
We project our own desire for simple, unbroken heroes onto these historical figures.
Hitzig wanted David the triumphant king, not David the weeping, exhausted, guilt-ridden man.
But Keil refuses to let Hitzig get away with that historical flattening.
Thank goodness.
Keil mounts a thorough, devastating defense of David's authorship by pointing directly to the historical records in the Book of Taste and Samuel.
Yeah, Keil brings the historical receipts to prove David was entirely capable of severe despondency.
He cites numerous documented instances where David wept openly, bitterly, and publicly.
Right, like 2 Samuel 1.12, where David weeps over the death of his enemy Saul and his friend Jonathan.
Or chapter 3, verse 32, where David weeps at the grave of Abner.
And chapter 12, verse 21, details his agonizing fasting and weeping for his dying infant son.
In chapter 15, verse 30, it shows him weeping as he flees barefoot up the Mount of Olives.
To escape his own son Absalom.
Yeah. And chapter 19, verse 1 describes him weeping inconsolably after Absalom is actually killed.
So the historical record is abundantly clear. David was a man of extreme emotional volatility.
He was intimately acquainted with severe depression and despondency. To claim he lacked the emotional capacity to write a melancholy poem requires ignoring the actual documented history of his life.
Keil establishes that David had the emotional capacity, but he takes the argument further by examining the linguistic evidence, too.
This is where it gets really technical and fascinating.
Keil details how the specific phrasing in this text was coined by David, and he proves it by showing how later ancient writers copied the precise phrasing.
Keil refers to this as an anthological relationship.
Right. He contrasts the linguistic style here with other authors.
He notes that the language of Heman the Ezrahite in Psalm 88 is perceptibly different. But when you look at the writings of the prophet Jeremiah,
who lived centuries after David.
Right. Centuries later, you see massive similarities. Jeremiah's prophecies are packed full of direct echoes of Psalm 6.
Wait, hold on. If Jeremiah and David are using the exact same words, couldn't David have just copied Jeremiah?
That's exactly what Hitzig argued.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Hitzig argued that these echoes prove the psalm was written by Jeremiah, not David, and then attributed to David later.
So how do we definitively know who came first?
Keil answers that with a brilliant piece of literary analysis. He starts by noting that Jeremiah has a well-known anthological style across all of his writings.
Meaning he quotes older stuff.
Yeah, Jeremiah constantly quotes and reproduces earlier literature to give his prophecies theological weight.
Okay, but how does Keil prove the sequence for this specific psalm?
He provides a specific, undeniable proof using Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 25.
Walk us through the mechanics of that proof.
Okay, so in Jeremiah 10, the prophet uses language that heavily resembles Psalm 6.
Okay. If you stop reading there, Hitzig might have a case.
Right. But immediately after using that Psalm 6 language without missing a single beat, Jeremiah continues the sentence with words directly taken from Psalm 79.
Oh, wow. So he deliberately strings two older, distinct psalms together to form a new prophetic statement.
Yes. It functions just like common law legal precedent.
That's a great way to put it.
Think about it. If a 19th century judge writes a legal opinion, and in one sentence he quotes a ruling from 1790, and in the next sentence he quotes a ruling from 1810.
You do not assume the 1790 judge time-traveled and copied the 19th century judge?
No, you know the newer judge is pulling from an established older body of foundational law to give his current ruling absolute authority.
Because Jeremiah weaves Psalm 6 and Psalm 79 together into a single thought. It cements his role as the reproducer.
He is drawing from an established older body of Davidic literature.
The linguistic evidence of Jeremiah's quoting style, combined with the historical reality of David's emotional capacity, completely dismantles Hitzig's skepticism.
The text undeniably originates with David.
Knowing that David wrote it in a state of genuine, well-grounded guilt radically shifts how we read the text.
It changes the tone completely.
But Keil brings up a detail that forces us to change how we hear the text as well.
Ah, yes.
This poem wasn't written to be read silently on a page. It was written to be played as music.
The text opens with a highly specific musical direction. The Hebrew phrase is al-hashemineth.
Translated literally, it means upon the octave.
And the history of how scholars have interpreted that phrase is a perfect example of how dangerous it is to over-spiritualize ancient texts.
Oh, absolutely. When certain religious readers see a word like octave or the number 8, they immediately discard the practical meaning and try to find some mystical, allegorical code.
Right. The source material talks about how the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible produced in Alexandria, translated this phrase as hypertes ogdos.
And the early church fathers took that Greek translation and just ran wild with it.
The Alexandrian school of interpretation loved allegory. Keil mentions Gregory of Nyssa specifically.
What did Gregory say about it?
Gregory claimed that this phrase, upon the octave, was a mystical reference to the octave of eternal happiness.
Eternal happiness from a musical direction.
Yeah, he argued it was a theological cipher for the eternal age to come, playing on the idea of the number 8 symbolizing a new beginning after the 7 days of creation.
I mean, it is a highly poetic idea, but it is completely detached from the grammatical historical reality of the text.
Totally detached. Gregory took a practical stage direction for musicians and turned it into an eschatological fantasy.
But Keil rejects the allegorical method and brings the text firmly back to the ground.
He insists on a literal historical interpretation. He cross-references the phrase al-hashemineth with an entirely different historical book.
Which one?
1 Chronicles chapter 15, verse 21. By analyzing how the phrase functions in a narrative historical account of temple worship, Keil establishes that it is undeniably a musical direction for the Levitical choirs.
Keil also points out that it is not the name of a specific instrument, right?
Right. If it referred to an instrument with 8 strings, it would not have been called an octave.
The appropriate Greek translation for an 8-stringed instrument would be an octochord.
The passage in 1 Chronicles clarifies this by making a stark contrast between 2 different musical groups.
Walk us through that contrast.
It states that certain musicians were to play upon stringed instruments called nablas with a direction called al-alamoth,
Okay.
while others were to play with citherns using the direction al-hashemineth.
The contrast between those two directions unlocks Keil's interpretation.
It does. The phrase al-alamoth literally translates to maidens' voices.
In modern musical terms, we would call that the soprano register.
Exactly. It was a direction used for songs meant to be played in a high, bright, piercing register.
Keil points out that Psalm 46, a joyous, triumphant song celebrating God as a refuge, is accompanied by the direction al-alamoth.
It is meant to sound light, victorious, and elevated.
But Psalm 6
And Psalm 12, which is another incredibly gloomy and oppressive text,
are accompanied by al-hashemineth.
upon the octave, meaning the lower octave, the bass.
Keil equates it directly to the musical term al-ottava bassa. The musicians were instructed to play the melody in the heavy, low bass register.
Think about the sensory experience of temple worship with that in mind.
You have a man crushed by the realization of his own sin, feeling the full weight of divine justice pressing down on his chest, and he writes a poem of absolute despair.
And when he hands that text to the Levitical musicians, he gives them a strict sonic parameter.
He tells them, do not play this bright, do not play this high, tune your instruments down. I want this played in the lowest, heaviest, most vibrating bass register possible.
The listener is meant to feel the oppressive gloom vibrating in their chest cavity before the singer even articulates the first word.
The physical music is designed to mirror the theological reality of the text. It grounds the congregation in the sheer weight of the affliction.
It sets the stage perfectly.
So with those heavy bass notes ringing in our minds, let's move into the opening lyrics. We are looking at verses 2 through 4, which detail the anatomy of this affliction.
And the author opens by begging for a highly specific type of relief from God.
The text reads, Javi, not in thy wrath rebuke me, and not in thy hot displeasure chasten me.
Keil stops here to expand on a crucial theological distinction regarding the nature of divine discipline.
We have to separate the concept of chastisement from God's love and chastisement from God's wrath.
Right. Chastisement from God's love is essentially fatherly discipline.
It's designed to purify and correct.
It is meant to prove and strengthen a person's faith. Keil cites the book of Proverbs, noting that a righteous person should never decline this loving discipline.
To reject it would be to act against their own sanctification.
It functions like a surgeon's scalpel. It inflicts pain, but the explicit goal of the pain is healing and restoration.
But the chastisement of wrath operates with a completely different motive.
The chastisement of wrath is not restorative. It is designed to satisfy divine justice.
It is directed against a person who is obstinately rebelling against God.
Or someone who has fallen away from his favor through severe sin. The motive is purely punitive retribution.
Now, the source material brings up a debate with another 19th century scholar named Hengstenberg.
Who held a very different view on this.
Yeah, Hengstenberg argued that making a hard distinction between love and wrath during suffering is a mistake.
He claimed that all chastening, every single time God disciplines a human being, has wrath as its root principle.
Hengstenberg argued that when God strikes, he is always expressing anger on some fundamental level.
Hengstenberg's view was common, but Keil dismantles it completely by returning to the overarching narrative of Scripture.
How does he do that?
Keil points out that if you believe wrath is always the true and proper motive when God brings suffering, you are forced to ignore the entire theology of the book of Job.
Because Job shatters the idea that suffering always equals divine anger.
Exactly. Job was subjected to unimaginable chastisement, but God's motive was absolutely not wrath.
The prologue definitively proves God was highly pleased with Job.
Therefore, Hengstenberg's universal rule that suffering requires wrath fails the biblical test.
However, Keil concedes that for David, in this specific psalm, Hengstenberg's rule regarding wrath actually applies.
Because for David, the wrath is present due to his specific moral failure.
Keil assumes the historical tradition that David's adultery with Bathsheba and the subsequent murder he orchestrated to cover it up might be the historical occasion for this crushing guilt.
The chastisement bringing David to the edge of death currently has God's wrath as its primary motive.
It is a punitive strike against a king who abused his power and broke the law of his creator.
And Keil notes that it will remain punitive as long as David remains alienated from God's favor.
This brings us back to the theological genius of David's prayer. He isn't asking God to ignore justice.
No, he's asking for a fundamental change in their relational standing.
If, through sincere, agonizing penitence, David is restored to favor, the nature of the suffering shifts.
The punitive chastisement alters into loving chastisement.
The physical consequences of his sin might remain, right?
Yes, but the evil he is suffering, which originated in the principle of wrath, becomes a tool for discipline and purification.
He is pleading for the underlying motive behind the pain to change.
Keil actually includes a paraphrase from the great Italian poet Dante Alighieri to summarize this theological nuance.
I love that quote. Dante captured the essence of verse 2 like this. Lord, reprove me not with fury, and will not to correct me with wrath, but with sweetness and with perfect love.
Dante understood the desire for a relational shift. Getting rid of the physical suffering is secondary to fixing the broken relationship with God.
Because the physical suffering David is enduring is just horrifying. In verse 3, David prays for healing, pleading that he is fading away and that his bones are affrighted.
Keil's linguistic analysis of the specific Hebrew words used here is astounding.
What is the specific word David uses for fading away?
The Hebrew word is umlal, and Keil points out a fascinating grammatical anomaly regarding how this word is structured in the text.
Break down the grammar for us. Why is the structure of umlal strange?
Keil notes that umlal features a specific vowel pointing, a pathach.
Okay, what does that mean?
Under normal Hebrew grammatical rules, that pathach would make it a third-person verb.
But reading it as a third-person verb violates the syntax of the sentence, right?
Completely. Keil argues it is actually an adjective that has been forcefully shortened into a passive state.
Why was it shortened?
The pronunciation tone in the spoken Hebrew lies heavily on the preceding pronoun I, which is ani. The heavy stress on the I causes the following adjective umlal to contract and shorten.
So the grammar is physically contracting under the weight of the personal pronoun.
Yes, but the actual root meaning of the word adds another layer of dread.
Tell me about the root.
Keil tracks the root of umlal back to an older Arabic word, am. The primary meaning of that Arabic root is to stretch out lengthwise.
Okay, stretching out.
But Keil explains that the specific grammatical formation it takes here is analogous to Arabic verb forms used almost exclusively to express two things: fading colors, and severe physical defects.
Wow. It is a deeply haunting image. David isn't just saying he's tired.
Not at all.
He is using vocabulary that describes a vibrant, rich color being bleached out by the sun until it is dull, gray, and ruined.
He feels his life force, his vitality as a human being, literally fading into a defect.
He is becoming a physical shadow of himself.
And that physical fading is accompanied by absolute, uncontrollable terror. He says his bones are affrighted.
The specific Hebrew word used for affrighted is nibhal.
Yeah.
How does the word nibhal go beyond standard human fear? Because humans get scared all the time without their bones literally shaking.
Standard fear might trigger a fight-or-flight response. It gives you an adrenaline rush.
Right.
But Keil explains that the root of nibhal means something entirely different. It means to let go.
To let go.
Yeah. It expresses a condition of outward overthrow and inward consternation.
Oh, wow.
It is the physiological effect of a fright so severe that it completely disconcerts you. It deprives you of all bodily self-control.
It is the terror that turns your muscles to water. You let go of your posture. You let go of your strength because you are completely overthrown by the reality of divine judgment.
His soul is shaken even more violently than his physical body. He's experiencing an affliction beyond all other afflictions because the face of God is hidden from him.
The wrath is wearing him completely away, which triggers the most desperate, visceral moment in the entire first strophe.
Verse 4 ends with a raw, unfinished cry that breaks all poetic structure.
And thou, O Javi, how long?
The sentence just violently cuts off. He doesn't even finish the thought.
It is the sound of a man who has completely run out of breath and collapsed. It is a severe panic attack captured in ancient ink.
And that bodily terror spirals immediately into the next section of Keil's blueprint, verses 5 through 8, which detail the abyss and the flood.
The sheer physical exhaustion reaches its peak here because the bodily terror spirals into a terrifying theological reality regarding death.
In verse 5, David pleads for God to return to him and rescue his soul.
Let's look at the specific words for return and rescue.
The word for return is shuba.
And Keil makes a highly specific note about the phonetic pronunciation of this word.
He does. The accentuation marks in the Hebrew text are highly deliberate. Keil notes that the accent is placed on the ultima, the final syllable of the word.
Why is that significant?
He explains that this ultima accentuation is intended to secure the distinct, sharp pronunciation of the final syllable of shuba.
Because the very next word in the text begins with a similar aspirate sound.
Right. If the person reading or singing the text isn't careful, the end of shuba could be swallowed up and escape notice.
The ancient scribes were meticulous. They wanted to ensure that the desperate plea to return rang out clearly over the heavy bass instruments.
And the word for rescue is chilets.
Let's talk about chilets.
The root of chilets is a transitive verb. It means to free, or more violently, to pull loose.
To pull loose.
Keil connects it to an Arabic root meaning to be pure, but notes its proper functional meaning is to be loose or free.
So David feels that his spiritual affliction has taken deep, tangled root in his soul.
Yes, and he needs God to violently pull him loose from it. He knows he cannot untangle himself.
He asks for this extraction solely on the ground of God's mercy towards sinners.
And he gives God a highly specific theological motive for why his life should be spared.
He says, "For in death there is no remembrance of thee. In Sheol who can give thee thanks?"
The primary reason he wants to survive this panic attack is not just to enjoy breathing oxygen again.
Right. It is to maintain his ability to praise God.
That is the ultimate tragedy for the ancient psalmist. The cessation of biological life is secondary to the cessation of worship.
In Sheol, there is no praising God.
We really need to explain the concept of Sheol.
We do, because modern readers often reflexively conflate it with the later developed Christian concept of hell.
But Keil clarifies what the ancient Hebrew mind actually pictured when they used that word.
Sheol is the ancient Hebrew name for the grave. It is the yawning abyss.
Keil notes that the etymological root of the word means to sink or to hang down.
It implies a dark depth, a massive sinking in.
To the ancient writers of the Psalms, Sheol was the single, universal gathering place of all the dead in the depth of the earth.
The ancient Israelites believed everyone went there, regardless of their moral standing during life.
They believed the dead lived a shadowy, quasi-life there, but it was universally lamentable.
Because the inhabitants were completely secluded from the light of the living world.
And infinitely worse, secluded from the light of God's presence. There is no joy, no corporate worship, and no remembrance of God's saving acts in Sheol.
It is a realm of theological silence.
Keil actually uses this specific description of Sheol to win a major historical argument regarding when the text was written.
Oh, this is a critical piece of historical evidence,
Various modern scholars try to date these psalms extremely late.
pushing them all the way to the Maccabean period, which is hundreds of years after David, much closer to the time of Christ.
But Keil argues that by the Maccabean period, Jewish theology had developed a much more complex, compartmentalized view of the afterlife.
Separating the righteous from the wicked into different realms.
Right. The fact that Psalm 6 only knows of one single gloomy gathering place for all the dead definitively proves it belongs to a much earlier, older era of Hebrew thought.
It shatters the late dating theory entirely.
The terror of sliding into this dark, silent abyss drives David to total physical collapse.
The bodily imagery in verses 6 and 7 is visceral. We have to look at the specific Hebrew vocabulary for weeping because the hyperbole is intense.
Let's start with the phrase where he says he makes his bed to swim.
The Hebrew verb used there is himshah.
It is a causative form, specifically a hifil, derived from the root sacha, which means to swim.
The hifil form literally means causing the bed to swim.
He follows that by claiming he floods his couch with tears. The word for tear is dimma.
In Arabic, the cognate word means a single tear.
But in Hebrew, as Keil points out, dimma represents a massive, overwhelming flood of tears. He is claiming he's dissolving his own bed with his grief.
It is poetic hyperbole, but it expresses the severe physical reality of absolute dehydration from non-stop sobbing. He is physically emptying himself out.
And then there is the horrifying phrase describing his eyes in verse 8. Sunken is mine eye with grief. It is grown old because of all mine oppressors.
What is the Hebrew word translated as grown old?
The word is ash. Keil notes that ashish appears to be a denominative derived from a root meaning to be moth-eaten.
A moth-eaten eye.
Think about the destructive process of a moth eating a garment.
It slowly eats away at the structural integrity of the fabric until it is brittle, full of holes, and completely falling apart.
David is saying his eyes are so swollen, so red, and so devoid of light they look like ruined, moth-eaten fabric.
And he blames this severe physical decay directly on his oppressors. The word he uses for them is zori.
Keil traces the word zorre to a root that means to press, to squeeze, and especially to bind together or constrict.
The physical squeezing, the zori, sounds exactly like the constriction someone feels in their chest during a massive cardiac event or a severe panic attack.
It is the physiological sensation of not being able to expand your lungs.
The physical constriction and the spiritual terror are inextricably linked here.
The physical tightness in his chest is the somatic, bodily manifestation of his spiritual realization. He feels violently constricted because he knows he is cut off from God's expansive presence.
The human enemies are squeezing him from the outside, but the well-grounded wrath of God is constricting him from the inside.
The bodily collapse is the direct, unavoidable result of the spiritual alienation.
He is completely pinned down. He is fading out, moth-eaten, dehydrated from sobbing, and terrified of the silent abyss of Sheol.
He has hit the absolute rock bottom of the heavy bass octave we talked about earlier.
And then, without any warning or transition, everything changes.
Which brings us to the final segment of Keil's blueprint, the sudden reversal in verses 9 through 11.
Right when the physical and emotional exhaustion hits its absolute lowest point, the text violently and unexpectedly pivots.
Keil quotes a writer named Frisch, who wrote a book called David's Newly Sounding Harp, to describe the sheer speed of this moment.
What does Frisch say?
Frisch says, even before his plaintive prayer is ended, the divine light and comfort come quickly into his heart.
His enemies were mocking him as a man totally forsaken by God, but suddenly, in a fraction of a second, he knows he is justified.
It is a massive, whiplash-inducing psychological snap.
In verses 9 and 10, the author repeats a threefold assurance that completely replaces his terror with unshakable confidence.
Let's break down the specifics of that threefold assurance.
Yeah, please do.
First, he declares that Yahweh have heard his loud weeping, his sobbing. The Hebrew word is shama.
Okay.
Second, he repeats the exact same verb. Yahweh have heard his supplication.
And third,
He states the logical consequence of being heard. Yahweh will accept his prayer. The word for accept is yikach.
God hears the sobbing, God hears the articulated words, therefore God accepts the prayer.
It is a logical progression of absolute restored faith.
The punitive wrath has been transformed back into fatherly discipline.
But what happens to the human enemies? What happens to the people who are squeezing him?
The author turns on them aggressively in verse 11. He declares they will be put to shame.
Keil's analysis of the Hebrew word for shame, bosh, reveals that it means much more than just feeling mildly embarrassed.
Walk us through the roots of bosh, because it carries a much heavier physical consequence.
Keil tracks bosh back to older Arabic roots, specifically bat and bayun.
And what do those mean?
The literal meaning of these ancient roots is not about losing face socially. It means to root up, to violently disperse, to scatter about things that lie together.
Oh, wow.
It means to be completely perplexed and to lose one's bodily self-control.
The loss of self-control. That is the identical concept to the terror David felt back in verse 3 when his bones were affrighted.
The consternation is completely reversed. The exact inward overthrow and outward panic that David was suffering under the wrath of God is now transferred directly onto his enemies.
The higher power turns the human assailants back, filling them with the very terror and physical constriction they were causing David.
The malicious trap they set for him snaps shut on their own legs.
And this brings us to what might be the most brilliant piece of linguistic analysis in Keil's entire commentary.
Oh, the grand finale.
He details the grand finale of the psalm, the very last 3 words of the Hebrew text, and points out a piece of musical and literary genius that is totally invisible in English translations.
The final 3 words in the Hebrew text are Yeshubu Yeboshu Raga.
They translate to, "They shall turn away ashamed suddenly."
Keil points out that all 3 of these words share a highly specific grammatical feature. They are all what grammarians call malels.
Explain the mechanics of a mile for those of us who have not studied the accentuation rules of biblical Hebrew.
A mile is a word where the accent, the heavy stress of the pronunciation, falls on the penult.
Which is the second to last syllable.
Right. The alternative is a milra, where the stress falls on the final syllable.
Okay.
Because these 3 words are all miles, the stress hits early, avoiding a heavy, drawn-out ending on the last syllable.
Keil describes this specific accentuation as creating a tripping measure. If you say it out loud, ya su bu ye bu shu are ga, it is fast.
It is a rapid-fire, almost frantic rhythm.
After all the heavy, slow, drawn-out groaning and the elongated middle strophe of the previous verses, the poem suddenly accelerates to top speed.
The phonetic rhythm of the spoken words physically mimics the sudden, frantic scrambling and scattering of the panicked enemies.
But Keil finds an even deeper layer of genius in the spelling of the words.
There is a visual and auditory chiasmus occurring here, a literal linguistic reversal.
How so?
Keil points out that the letters in the sound of the word yeboshu, which means shamed,
Yeah.
are the direct mirror of the word yeshubu, which means turn back.
Yeshu, yeboshu. The consonants mirror each other perfectly.
The linguistic structure of the sentence physically reverses itself, just as the fate of the enemies is reversed.
It is a phonetic anagram of divine justice.
Keil gets so excited by discovering this that his rigid academic German tone completely shatters.
He literally uses exclamation points in his published commentary.
He writes, "What music there is in the Psalter, if composers could but understand it."
It is a beautiful moment of a brilliant scholar being genuinely moved by the architecture of the text he is studying.
The visual layout of the letters, the phonetic sound of the consonants, the metrical rhythm of the miles, and the theological meaning of the reversal all align perfectly in those final 3 words to enact the sudden justification of the author.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's recap the progression of the diagnostic landscape we've just walked through.
We started by defining the severe nature of the author's suffering.
He was not a victim of random providential circumstances. He was dealing with the crushing, constricting weight of well-grounded guilt, seeking to turn punitive wrath into loving discipline.
We saw how David's authorship is proven not just by the historical accounts of his emotional depths in 2 Samuel, but by the anthological evidence of later prophets like Jeremiah legally reproducing his exact phrasing.
We tuned our ears to the musical direction, stripping away the over-spiritualized allegories of the Alexandrian church fathers to realize this was meant to be played in the heavy, low, vibrating register of the bass octave.
We walk through the anatomy of affliction, observing the fading colors, the letting go of all self-control, and the raw, unfinished cries of a spiritual panic attack.
We descended into the physical and theological abyss, looking at the threat of Sheol, the moth-eaten eyes, and the flood of tears caused by the constricting squeeze of absolute spiritual isolation.
And finally, we witnessed that sudden, tripping musical reversal.
A linguistic mirror where despair is violently scattered and the enemies lose their self-control in a rapid-fire rhythm of sudden faith. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over.
It is something that builds on all this source material, but points to a reality regarding faith that we all face.
Look closely at the precise shift between verse 8 and verse 9. In verse 8, David is completely dehydrated from crying, his bones are shaking, his eyes are ruined, and he is terrified of dying.
In verse 9, he is declaring absolute victory and ordering his enemies to depart in panic.
But here is the catch. Absolutely nothing in his external circumstances changed in that fraction of a second.
The human enemies with weapons were still standing right there outside his door.
The physical sickness remained in his body. The external threats had not moved a single inch. Yet total, crushing despair flipped into absolute, unshakable confidence in a split second. How does that happen?
It happens because the most monumental, life-altering shifts in reality happen entirely within the hidden, silent space of the human mind before a single thing in the physical world actually alters.
The physical evidence of his life looked identical, but the internal architecture of his soul had completely rebuilt itself upon the assurance of justification.
The music of his reality had shifted, even if the surrounding world had not caught up to the rhythm yet.
Think about that the next time you feel pinned down by guilt or circumstances. The shift happens inside first. Thanks for listening to Reformed Thinking. We will see you on the next deep dive.